morning. Welcome to the 4th Annual Smithsonian Food History Weekend at the National Museum of American History. My name is Paula Johnson, and I'm a curator in the Division of Work and Industry here at the museum, and I'm the project director for the exhibition right next door, Food, Transforming the American Table. Hope you take a look at it later today. It's a pleasure to open this day of roundtables. This is a key component of our weekend, which is devoted to exploring how food history underlies, illuminates, shapes, and expands American history. On behalf of the entire food history team, and you've seen some of us this morning, thank you for participating in the roundtables and demonstrating your interest in this year's theme. Regions Reimagined grew out of feedback we received from museum visitors who wanted to see something about American regional foodways in our exhibitions or our programs. So over the course of several months, we explored the theme in our demonstration kitchen by framing our Cooking Up History series around regional histories, recipes, and ingredients. From Southern Maryland stuffed ham to the regional foods of baseball, to the influences of new migrants on Southern culinary traditions, to Mexican regional cuisines and their diverse expressions here in the United States. In other words, we verified, not that we really needed to, but we verified that there's plenty of meat in this theme. And so in step with food studies scholarship and the work of writers from many disciplines, we decided to focus this weekend on the intersections of place, people, and food, and the impacts of social, cultural, economic, and environmental change over time. Our conversations about food history actually started last night at a gala that raised funds to support our work here at the museum. Last night, the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and the Culinary Arts honored Mary Sue Milliken and Susan Feniger with the 4th Annual Julia Child Award in recognition of their work as innovative chefs, as longtime business partners in their Los Angeles restaurants, notably the City Cafe and Border Grill. But they're also philanthropists and advocates for sustainability and social justice. And tomorrow, we'll turn up the heat for our all-day festival, a day of hands-on learning, live cooking demonstrations, featured talks with special guests, book signings, and all topped off with a brewing history event featuring brewers and beer from 4 distinct regions in the U.S. In the evening. So there's a lot to explore this weekend, and we hope that your participation today will be just one part of your experience. So our 4 roundtables today are designed to take a broad view of the ever-shifting relationships between place and food. We'll grapple with changing perspectives on the very concept of region and how those different ideas have shaped our sense of self and community, how they've been expressed through food, and how they have influenced the development of food enterprises and impacted agricultural landscapes. In the second roundtable, we'll look at how economic and political entities influence regional food cultures and explore who gets a say in the shifting and changing of those food-related identities. And this afternoon, we'll focus on 2 place studies, the Pacific Northwest and the South, 2 geographically, environmentally, and culturally complex areas that have received significant attention over time, yet remain wide open for exploration, interpretation, and, yes, reimagining. Each roundtable features some of the most distinguished food scholars, historians, chefs, writers, growers, and thought leaders in the country. We're absolutely delighted to have such extraordinary participants, and I'd like to take a moment right now at the beginning to thank all of our panelists and moderators for joining us today. And I would also like to thank our donors for their generous support and their shared commitment to food history here at the Smithsonian, the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and the Culinary Arts, John Deere, the Brewers Association, Wegmans, Hilton, Melissa's Produce Company, the Willard Intercontinental Hotel, and the many individuals and groups that attended last night's gala. And then, of course, thanks to all of you for being here and participating in these important conversations. Through your attendance, through your feedback and your support, we've all been able to grow our food history initiative into something that extends kind of organically into all aspects of the museum and has engaged our colleagues around the mall and around the country as well as the public around the country. So before we dive into our first roundtable, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Adam Rosen, the Director of Programming in our Office of Audience Engagement. Adam is going to provide the essential information about the format of the day and everything you're going to need to know to participate in today's agenda. Adam?
Good morning. Thanks, Paula. Really appreciate that. Again, I'm Adam Rosen, the Director of Programs and Audience Development at the National Museum of American History. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 4th Annual Smithsonian Food History Weekend and today's roundtables. As Paula mentioned, I'll be with you all day with some friendly hints and tips about how to make this all a smooth and productive day and an enjoyable day for yourselves. Today is the second day of the Smithsonian Food History Weekend. You can find out more about what else is happening this weekend in your program, and we hope to see you throughout the weekend. Now, onto the roundtables. Each discussion today will be 1 hour. The first 45 minutes will be a conversation. Then we'll open up for 15 minutes of questions and answers from you. If you want to ask a question during your Q&A, and we hope that you do, you can tweet your questions using hashtag #SmithsonianFood. And our Q&A facilitator, Amelia Grabowski, in the back, there she is, we'll gather them up and present as many as we have time to our panelists. Or, if you'd like to stick to paper, as many of you would like to, you can probably write your questions on the card you received on your way in and hand it to one of our theater ushers. Let's quickly ask our ushers to raise their hands. There they are. Great. And our ushers will deliver those cards to Amelia for you. We are thrilled to welcome Corby Crummer, award-winning journalist and author of The Joy of Coffee, The Pleasure of Slow Food, and numerous articles and essays. The San Francisco Examiner declared him a dean among food writers in America. And I think we all can agree that having a dean as our first moderator will set us up for a great day. Our first panel, The Power of Place, will explore the big ideas about the ever-evolving concept of region and how that has shaped and changed American food culture over time. Now let's dive in. Corby?
Thank you. I'm now a senior lecturer at the Tufts Friedman School of Nutrition, and I think what all these titles mean is old, but also experienced. So I'm delighted to have this great panel, which I have to compliment Paula Johnson, who was just introducing us. The way she's put this day together, such enterprise and thorough scholarship. We're all really delighted to be here. And I'm glad to meet my panelists, whom, with the wonderful exception of Ronnie, I didn't know. So we're going to start with Bill Cronin. And we will have a few minutes of each of them answering a few introductory questions. Then we'll have our conversation. But during all of it, I urge you to tweet questions and write them down. We want an overflowing stack of questions in our last 15 minutes that will be rapid fire and provocative and ask anything. We all want you to ask anything. So Bill is an extremely distinguished historian and geographer who began really the field of, or was a very distinguished exemplar of the field of looking at regionalism in America. You can see his work on his really impressively designed website, williamcronin.net, C-R-O-N-O-N. And the book of many that you'll find that he said was most relevant to today's discussion is called Nature's Metropolis, Chicago and the Great West. We'll be talking about not just the Great West, though. I was going to ask Bill by saying, tell us about the idea of regions. When did regions develop even in American history?
So my quick answer to that question, I think, is that I'd offer two observations for us at the beginning of this whole conversation today about place and region, which is, on the one hand, I think it's really important to remember that region is not one thing. It's a nested thing. So if you all reflect on where you're from, think about the place or places that are central to your own identity. The answer to that is never one thing. And in fact, if you've only lived in one place, you still don't live in just one region. So I live in Madison, Wisconsin, which is in Dane County in southern Wisconsin, on the edge of the parts of Wisconsin that are glaciated and unglaciated. I live in the upper Great Lakes. I live in the upper Mississippi Valley. I live in the north. I live in a region that was called the Midwest, though it was once called the Old Northwest, and before that it was called the Northwest. It's sometimes called the Heartland. You see, I live in North America, I live in the United States, I live in the Western Hemisphere, yada, yada, yada. It goes on and on and on like that. And that's organic to the way region works.
That's Google
That's
Earth in reverse.
What? And so you want to remember that, and then you also want to remember that it is intrinsically historical, which is to say, all the places I just named, each of them has a history. Each of them emerges over time. And at different moments, different ways of defining place mattered differently. So if we go back in American history, there was a moment when there were three great regions in the United States in the 19th century before the Civil War, one called the North, one called the South, and then a kind of indeterminate region called the West that kept changing in its definition, and which, in fact, was one of the causes of the Civil War, because the question of whether North and South were going to reproduce themselves in the place called the West was one of the driving struggles over which section would control the Senate. And what the balance of votes in the Senate would be over slavery would be one of the crucial things that would lead to the Civil War. So that's all background to food.
And I'll just interject, if anyone is lucky enough to get into the Museum of African American History, there's so much about exactly that passage, the West and the fight over the West.
The fight over the West is absolutely pivotal and central. And so the founder of my field of Western history was a man named Frederick Jackson Turner. And his most famous essay, the essay that many of you may have heard of, is called The Significance of the Frontier in American History, published in 1893. But he also wrote an essay, less well known, called The Significance of the Section in American History. And it's about this question. It's about the emergence of region, the emergence of section, the emergence of difference. And the word I just used, I think, is crucial to our whole conversation today, which is difference. Regions come into being in counterpoint to each other, in opposition to each other, in relationship to each other. Region is always relational. And as we think about how my interest in environment relates to the focus of today's conversation about food, I would just remind us that food is always an expression of place. Food is raised. Food is grown. It comes from animals. It comes from plants. And whether you're in the eastern woodlands, whether you're in the southeast, whether you're in the Mississippi Valley, whether you're on the Great Plains, whether you're in the Rockies, whether you're in the Great Basin, whether you're in California, whether you're in the Pacific Northwest, very different foods are in those environments, are in those places. And if you eat from those places, in those places, intrinsically different foods are going to make their way onto your plate just by virtue of those regions. Now, I just gestured at something called physiographic provinces that were invented as an idea, and I'll stop with this. Here in Washington, by a man whose name will be familiar to many in this room, John Wesley Powell, the guy who went down the Colorado River, one-armed Civil War veteran in 1869. But he drew the first map that showed those regions, Great Plains, Great Basin, those places. That was drawn in the 1880s. That way of thinking about environment and place emerged here in the Smithsonian's orbit as a way of broadly defining how we combine these different parts of the North American landscapes with their different environments and the different foods that emerge from them. I could keep going, but I think I should stop with that.
Well, I would like to pick up on food. So food is, of course, intrinsic to this idea because different things grow and are used differently. But when does it become part of a region's self-identification? And when does it become part of the American culture that people in New York City think, oh, those people in the West eat blank, or in the South they eat cornbread and watermelon? When do these foods start acquiring an identity that's tied to the place?
So when you say a region's self-identity, it seems to me you're pointing at the very heart of the matter, which is, I'm not sure regions have identities They don't have selves. What they have are people who live within them, who say, I'm from this place, I'm of this place defines me in a particular way. And then there's another set of people.
You're setting up our next two speakers. So
I am indeed setting that up. So I'm of this place, I'm from this place, and one of the things that makes me feel like I belong here is that when I was growing up, this was what was on the breakfast table. These were the foods that were served to me every morning. And that memory of my childhood, that memory of my own becoming, which is of this place, comes out of that. There's another set of people, though, and this is really important, equally to the story, who are not of that place, but who looking at that place say, well, this is different from me. When I go to that place, I want to experience that. I want to go there and have this experience that is not my childhood experience, but I'm going to go and sample this other way of being that I associate. And that's, I would say, although I can point you at examples of that from the 19th century, I think that emerges more in the 20th. The 30s are the great era of regionalism in the United States, where the Federalist Writers Project in the middle of the New Deal writes those American guides. The American Guidebook series, most of which are now downloadable and online. You should grab them all. They're an amazing set of documents for our topic.
Wonderful.
They're wonderful books that were meant to employ unemployed writers during the 1930s, but they are anchoring documents of regional identity. That's one of their goals. And so we build a sense of an America that has all these different Americas inside of it. And then those books and the tourist experience of going to those places to experience them is how we sample the diversity of the nation.
So you stole my word, which is cultural tourism. Does that start at the era of the Great Depression, which seems doubtful?
No.
When do people have the idea, I have to sample these different things if I go to?
It goes way back. I mean, it's part of the grand tour of Europe in the 18th century, all those journeys that
But in the U.S., I mean.
In the U.S., there are communities in New England before the Civil War in the 1830s and 1840s where New Yorkers are going up into Vermont, are going into New Hampshire, and are sampling New England foods in that space we can go way back to the antebellum period to see that kind of tourism emerging in that place. In the early 19th century, it's often about going toward the wilderness, going toward Mount Holyoke, going to the Catskills, going to the Catskill Mountain House and experiencing that pull from the city in that place.
Well, we were both born in the nutmeg state.
We were.
Connecticut, which was very valuable nutmegs, but it also acquired its reputation as selling wooden nutmegs and cheating people. So food has always a double identity. Thank you. On to Sean Sherman. So Sean Sherman is known as the sous chef. You will see why from his braids. And the book that Ronnie Lundy has cooked from with great pleasure and success, we have a personal testimonial here.
I swear.
Is the Sous Chef's Indigenous Kitchen, which the James Beard Foundation gave its Best American Book Award to.
Also wonderfully researched and written.
Say it again.
Also wonderfully researched and written. It's a very important book.
So those of us who don't own it are going to by the end of the day, because that's the miracle of online purchasing, although we urge you to go to local bookstores and patronize them.
I think our books are for sale here.
Well, that's how local it gets. Right here, you will buy his book
Buy
right
locally.
at the end of this session, because that's the most important result of a panel. Buy the book. So for you, you say that you re-identify North American cuisine and reclaim an important culinary culture that was often long buried and often inaccessible. What inspired you to do this, and what were the cultures you first wanted to rediscover?
Well, my perspective is quite a bit different because I grew up on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. I was born in 1974. When I was born, it hadn't even been 100 years since the Lakota had lost their homeland, basically. Pine Ridge had barely been a thing within that 100-year period at that point in time.
Right.
As a chef, I became very curious. I had kind of an epiphany one time after I'd been a chef in Minneapolis for a few years, and then realized that I'm living in this wonderful little food city in the Midwest. I can walk around and find all sorts of great stuff. Within a few blocks of the neighborhood I was in, I could find Korean food, German food, Japanese food, food from all over the world, but nothing that represented the land and the history of where I was standing. And it just didn't really make sense to me. And I also realized as a Lakota man that as a chef that I could name off hundreds of European recipes, and I could barely name 10 Lakota recipes. So it really shot me on this path to try to understand, what were my Lakota ancestors eating just over 100 years ago. Because this was not ancient history I was trying to dig into. I was not trying to look at a timepiece of food at 1491. I was looking at what was my great-grandfather eating, basically. Because of the history during that time period, you have to understand that my great-grandfather being born in the 1850s, during his lifetime, he sees the struggle of the Lakota against the U.S. government and the loss of culture and loss of everything. He sees his kids going to boarding school. He sees his kids growing up and fighting for the U.S. government, all within one lifetime. So I started really researching, what were Lakota eating? What were they putting away for the winter? How were they surviving? What kind of flavors were they utilizing? How were they doing food preservation? Where did they get things like salts and fats and sugars? Which kind of animals, which kinds of plants? Was there agriculture? All of these questions, and started slowly piecing it together because it was shattered information. It was kind of very much hidden. I couldn't just go online and order Joy of Native American Cooking.
So how did you piece it together and also shattered?
It was like, slowly putting together a broken pot and taking pieces and filling in holes and making solid, theories about things and looking for facts and foods.
That's a beautiful description of the historian's labor. But where did you do it?
So I was in Minneapolis. Well, actually, I had lived in Mexico during that time period in the mid-2000s. And I was really kind of studying some of the cultures down there. I was living on the Nayarit coastline on the Pacific. And I moved back to the States into Montana, where I really started actively researching and trying to figure out, can I figure this food out? And when I was a kid, I worked for the Forest Service in the Black Hills, so my job was a field surveyor, so I had to go out and learn all the plants in the northern Black Hills, which that skill set came in pretty handy as a chef much later. So I started looking at wild foods. I started really trying to reconnect and understand, because that was something that I could share with my ancestors, knowing that indigenous peoples utilized plants. I started reading more about agriculture and discovering how much agriculture was way up in the region that I had grown up in without even knowing about it. How people had been farming on the Missouri River Valley for almost 2,000 years, and there was so much corn culture all the way northward, which was such a big epiphany. And then I just started branching outwards and outwards and outwards and looking at other regions. And so we look at pre-colonial North America. It didn't really matter which side was speaking Spanish, which side was speaking English, which side was speaking kind of a funny French. But the rest of it was, those were all colonial pieces, right? We were looking at the background of what was sitting there in North America. So still today, there's 574 tribes in the U.S., 634 in Canada, and a third of Mexico still speaks an indigenous language. So when you look at an indigenous language map of North America, you see an amazing patchwork. So every 100 miles, you're in a different religion, a different language. There's different foods, there's different traditions. And it would be amazing to think about stopping at all of these indigenous-based traditional food businesses across the way. And that was the vision that kind of pushed us forward, to have a deeper understanding of what are really these foods. Because you look at just the diversity, the biological diversity of North America and the plant diversity that's out there. Then we layer it with all the different diversity of peoples that are out there. And we see this amazing diversity that we could be celebrating all over the place, because even in the microregions of southern Wisconsin to northern Wisconsin, it's completely different, right? So there's all of this wonderful layering, and I really think that Americans have to accept that, people lived here before Laura Ingalls, right?
Well, a book I got to edit was called 1491 by Charles Mann.
Yeah,
So
that's
a
beautiful book.
Wonderful book about this. The beautiful description of putting together a pot. This is an amazingly dumb question. How many of these dishes did you have to reconstruct, and how many are still part of living memory in the people you interviewed, or even yours?
Yeah, so there was so much pieces because it was really simple. So we started seeing all the diversity of foods out there, but also a lot of the commonalities within indigenous peoples. And that vein of indigenous foodways kind of stretched around the world. So we see people cooking without petroleum, so using live fire for lots of cooking technique. We see food preservation being lots of drying technique. We see different ways of acquiring salts, either through minerals, through waters, through plants, and things like that. So we see a lot of these very similar cooking techniques, and I did look for a lot of traditional recipes, you know. It was hard because by the time I was growing up, I didn't, you know, people always ask me, like, what did you eat growing up on the reservation? Because I want to hear about how I, you know, took down an elk in the morning with a homemade slingshot, you know. But I grew up with the
Served it
commodity.
on fry bread.
Yeah, I grew up with the commodity food program, which has been extremely devastating to many Native communities who have been surviving just off of that for almost a century now.
Is it in this building that there are rooms that show exactly what those commodity foods on reservations look like? Because there's a museum I've been to that has exactly, it shows the boxes from the 40s and 50s.
Yeah, because we just had black and white cans would say meat with juices, you know, beef with juice.
And that's what you grew up having.
Yeah.
And so were there old women? The first thing I assign my students always to write is find the oldest living member of your family or family friend and ask what they ate and try to connect it to the economy of the times. But did people talk about dishes that in your researches you found and they remembered eating?
They did, and what was more important was when we started doing all indigenous dinners, so cutting out colonial ingredients, so removing things that people weren't using here officially. So we removed dairy, wheat flour, processed cane sugar, beef, pork, chicken, and started really cooking regionally indigenous foods of whichever area we might be in. And then presenting them to these indigenous communities. And after these dinners, they would be, we called it ironically foreign, because people wouldn't be used to this flavor, right? So, after a lot of these elders would eat some of these foods, there would just be this outpouring of indigenous food memory coming out of them. And they'd be like, I forgot all about that flavor. My grandmother used to do this. The forest paths used to be so clear, and we'd go harvest all these pieces here and there. And it's amazing because it happens almost every single time we go to all these diverse communities all across the U.S. And that same thing happens over and over, because this work should have been done a lot stronger during my parents' generation, where there would have been a lot more memories out there to hold on to. And we're getting the grandkids of the kids who had seen the last of some of those traditional pieces out
Was it
there.
the arrival of commodity foods that was the watershed in a bad way?
It was a big part of it, because reservation systems and boarding school systems were the two pieces that really worked against indigenous peoples. And it's why we don't have Native American restaurants everywhere, because the boarding school and residential schools were basically erasing generations of knowledge. So thousands of generations of passed down knowledge of how to live sustainably in your region utilizing plants and animals were getting wiped off the map during an entire section of the late 1800s, early 1900s, even up into the 1990s in Canada, right?
Am I right in thinking there's a parallel in Australia?
Oh yeah, so you look at indigenous
All over the
countries
world.
around the world, wherever European settler colonialism happened, it's the same thing. Because there's really a difference between settler colonialism and capitalist colonialism. And the settler colonialism was really the most damaging, because that's the one that's putting, like, you look at the US, where the US is basically using immigrants as pawns, placing them all over this newly conquered West. And so you have families that grow up, they're German, they're Finnish, they're Norwegian, they're Irish, right? But it also eradicated the Native American peoples who had lived there for thousands of generations. And we basically, as Native Americans people, live in a post-genocide America, because we're at the stage of denial, where we're living in that denial for the past 100 years, where we don't talk about it. It's not in our history books. We don't learn about this when we're growing up. We have to search hard to even find that information to put it back together. But we can do this through food. And this food is such a beautiful way, because food is our cultural identity. And it does become a regional identity for us also.
Was that true for you even at Pine Ridge?
Yeah, because
Wounded Knee wasn't part of your...
I grew up, literally, I could see the hill where Wounded Knee was at when I was growing up as a kid. It was just right over there. You know, it was like a 20-minute drive through the country, but it was right there. So understanding that history was a big part of it, because my great-grandfather fought Little Bighorn with the Lakota. So I grew up with a cavalry saddle in our stable that was pillaged from after that war had happened, you know. And so those stories are passed down, you know, because we hear about that stuff. So it is a completely different perspective than normal, you know, just what is growing up in America, basically. But I think it's important for people to realize that food and history and land and region really play an important part. And you can't just look at America as 1800. You have to understand how deep the history goes and how people have survived for thousands of generations.
Beautifully put, and it sets up Ronnie.
There we
Thank
go.
you very much.
Yes.
So, Ronnie, what is Appalachia, and what was your idea before you started researching it for your brilliant book, Vittles, which you all have to own by the end of today, Vittles.
There will be a 10-point quiz.
Ronnie says if you go on the OED website and ask how to pronounce the Victuals, you will hear a friendly woman's voice in an English accent.
Sort of a stuffy accent, and she will say, Vittles,
Yes.
Vittles.
So that is Ronnie's book, which tells us so much about Southern regionalism that we didn't know. How did you get interested in, how did your ideas of what Appalachia was change during your research?
Well, I am Appalachian. And it's interesting, I was so interested in what you were saying about being from a region. I am Appalachian even when I'm not in Appalachia. And in fact, I formed my sense of being Appalachian when I was living with my family growing up in Louisville, Kentucky, which is not Appalachian at all. It's although I had to explain this to someone at the New York Times recently, but you know, bless their hearts, as we like to say.
We're really in deep territory when somebody says bless their heart.
I know. So I grew up with that sense of identity, and it's complicated to grow up with that sense of identity because Appalachia is one of probably the most mythologized region in the United States. There are a million stories about Appalachia. Many of them are here at the romantic end of the spectrum, and many more of them are here at the derisive, derogatory end of the spectrum. And my existence as an Appalachian and the existence of the people around me was at neither of those ends. You can see where the stereotyping comes from, you can see where the stories come from, but they didn't come from us. We have had our story given to us. I'm sure you have experienced this also, that we have had people tell us who we are. So the root of writing Vittles, I think, probably has to do with the fact that so many of my conversations with people about who I am and where I came from include the phrase, well, no, actually, that's not what it is, blah, 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 yada, yada. It's an incredibly diverse region. Even recently, the most popular book about the region that has come along, and blessedly, I've forgotten its name, but you know who I'm talking about. It characterizes the region as being a monoculture of Scot-Irish people, all with similar genetic propensity to certain behaviors. And it ain't true. There are Scot-Irish people. We were part of the settler capitalist. I'm so grateful. I'm taking that home with me right now, that definition, because I struggle with our history and our present, both understanding the settler capitalist and the
settler colonialism.
Colonialist, right, and the capitalist colonialist. Yeah. Yes, I'm struggling with it right now. So this is a part of one of the things I wanted to refer to that you said. I'm one of the people that Corby's students come interview now as the oldest living person they know doing this. And occasionally I don't remember, no. But the settler colonialist is largely who the Appalachian narrative has been about. At the romantic end of the spectrum, we now romanticize our Native American forebear that everyone supposedly has. At the derogatory end of the spectrum, at the point that the region was being settled by Europeans, there was, along with the actual physical destruction and of the native people living there at that time, the physical decimation, there was also a cultural decimation where the stories that were told about native people were the kind of derisive stories that we hear now about people. It's driven by capitalist colonialism, which saw in my region, and this is a piece of how you are defined by literal place, saw in that region an abundance of resources that they understood could be turned into money. And they sent in settler colonialists to do the dirty work of taking over this land. And once it was taken over, all the negative stories that we told about Native Americans, we then began to tell about the settler colonialists, because we needed to keep decimating the land and the culture in order to extract at the highest cost to the people in the place and the least cost to the capitalist the resources from the region.
Tell us in this.
How does that have to do with food?
No, in this division, what is the culture that's being displaced by exploitation of the resources? Were the Scotch-Irish already there, or were they sent in to do the exploiting?
They were sent in to do the exploiting, along with the Palatinate Germans, along with English serfs, or English indentured servants, along with, and then as time goes on, along with the Swiss, along with African Americans are in Appalachia doing the literal dirty killing work of extracting the salt from the salt fields that were violently and forcibly taken from the Shawnee in the Kanawha Valley. They are there at the end of the 1700s as leased slaves. One of the romantic myths about Appalachia is that we had no slavery. One of the derisive myths about Appalachia is that we are all bigots because we don't know any black people. The reality of Appalachia is that there have always been Afro-Latins or African Americans present both as slaves and as freed people in the history. And food was for me this really marvelous place of stepping in and starting to deconstruct this and learn the realities of what went on. But in the present moment, there's not a push. The people of Appalachia, well, they are being pushed out of the region. I mean, one of the things you hear about how do we save poor Appalachians is get them out of there. You know, why don't they go somewhere else where there are jobs? To which my answer always is, show me some jobs somewhere else that are worth leaving your family and your home and your garden and your history for the wage that is offered. They don't exist. But that same narrative evolves about Appalachians in order to justify destroying the land and creating a subhuman lifestyle for the people who live there. I didn't mean to get quite this dark in the very first moment.
But I was going to get darker, but not quite yet. So keep
Okay.
going.
All right, good. All right. Oh, well, it is a couple of days after Halloween, so we can do this. One of the things that I wanted to note about Appalachia that I think is important in the story of America overall, or certainly in the story of the United States, you pointed out that the original regions are the North, the South, and the West. Appalachia, depending upon where you stand, is all of those places.
It's on the border, right?
Yeah, it is. It's what I call the liminal space. Well, I mean, I don't call it the liminal, but I call it, the liminal space to me is the place where the most interesting work can be done, because it's the place where the borders and the structure gets crossed, and the mixture of identity begins to ravel, and then you can unravel, and it just gives you a very powerful narrative and a powerful understanding. The other thing that I wanted to mention what Sean was saying. I think it's very important for us, particularly in talking about foodways, it is impossible for me to talk about the foodways of Appalachia without talking about the foodways of Mesoamerica. And I don't know if that, meaning the regions that you're talking about. Our foodways are built on a culture that, as we've just been discussing, has been ignored and denied and co-opted, and there's an argument right now sometimes in the world of Southern food on whether or not Black people or European people made the first cornbread, so I have this picture in my mind, of Columbus's, or one of the first Spanish ships coming into the coast of South Carolina. Wouldn't have been Columbus, and the native people are waiting on shore, and there are the Spaniards, and there are the Moors, and there are the Arabs, and there are the Jews, and everybody coming from Europe, and the Native Americans are waving their corn cobs going, "Thank God you're here. What do we do with this?" I mean, that really is how the history, that is where we begin this conversation about food in this country, and it has to stop. It absolutely has to stop.
Okay. Well, low country cuisine could hardly be a better melting pot example.
Exactly.
But if I may, thank you for this fascinating discourse. Let's talk about the melting pot and the times in history, we'll go down the panel, when it unravels, when the idea of coming together and homogeneity becomes less attractive to groups within a region, and regional identity, and let's try to relate it to food, becomes very politically important. And Bill, can you think of examples when there are resurgences in this importance of, let's say, even tribal and place identity in American history, and when it becomes particularly important? And are we in such a moment now?
We're definitely in such a moment now, and I'd say we've been in such a moment since the Second World War, which is really the moment, and Sean pointed at it, the boarding school experience and the experience of an intentional, systematic effort at erasure, pulverization of tribal identity that all the Native peoples in the United States and Canada experienced. And,
But let me just say, I thought the Second World War was the moment of the great coming together.
Well, what's interesting, you look at the people who emerge on the reservations in the 1950s, in building the foundations on which the Indian Power Movement, AIM, will be created in Minneapolis in the 1960s. It's people who serve in the military and who learn the skills of institutional politics. I mean, the tribal leaders who come out of that World War II experience know how to work the system. And that's the irony of the boarding school experience, right? It teaches the tools that ultimately become the tools of resistance against the very institutions that were intended to destroy that resistance. They actually empower that resistance, which is the paradox of, in quotes, the pan-Indian movement of the 20th century, where the ability of the tribes from the very different places that the peoples come from to come together and build a resistance in that space is one of the ironies that happens. And so the moment, and we think of the 50s as the nascent beginning of the African-American civil rights movement, but we see the same thing happening on the reservations and in the cities, because that, of course, is a crucial part of the Native American story. The urban peoples who lead the resistance and who carry that resistance and organize it on the reservations in the 60s and 70s become the foundation on which your work really gets built in that space. And it's the reason why you're doing the work you're doing where you're doing it right now. It's a really important center. We don't think of Minneapolis-St. Paul as a great center of Native politics, but it's hugely important in the history of Native politics.
And Sean, when you were doing your researches, did the tribal elders not only sort of sigh when they were served this food and have a flood of memories coming back, but do you think that rediscovering foods is part of a political identity?
It really is, because as Indigenous peoples, we really have had zero political voice for such a long time. Up until that point in the 60s, I mean, we couldn't even vote on Pine Ridge up until the 60s at all, So it was something like, I grew up in politics. My mom worked for Tom Daschle in South Dakota throughout my whole upbringing. So I was always around politics growing up. And I think it is important to be able to learn the best of both worlds, because realizing that I did learn a lot of schools, or a lot of skills, I'm sorry, and was able to maneuver in this world today pretty well and learn a lot and apply those lessons. And then to go back and start to learn the lessons of my ancestors on a whole other spectrum, to learn about, to connect with the earth and the plants and the environment and the seasons and all of those, that ancestral knowledge that should have been passed down through my family anyways, and to start to pick that up slowly but surely moving forward, and to be able to create something that becomes a resource for other people to help to build off of too, and to start to open up doors to it, was a really important step forward for me. And we see this, like, I feel like we've come a long ways in a very few short years of doing this work and this business. I feel like we're still at the beginning because there's so much more to explore out there. And I think we are going to empower, and the Indigenous people should have a voice out there when it comes to politics. Because right now, a Republican North Dakota senator has the voice of basically all of Native America, which doesn't make any sense, right? So, because Indigenous peoples need to speak for themselves. So, and this will crawl into a point where we have a larger voice, and we will be able to have a political stance, viewpoint on many things that directly impact us, which is environment most of the time.
Mm-hmm. Ronnie, did food play a part in regional identity for Appalachians? And is there a resurgence of it? And what do you see in how Appalachian sense of self as it relates to voting in politics has evolved since you started making this your area of study?
Well, do we have a week? This is, and before I go there, I want to go back to your point about that moment. As you know, Corby, a Southern food writer can only talk about 5 minutes before they begin to say John Edgerton's name. But John Edgerton wrote the Bible called Southern Food. That's not the book I want to reference right now. He also wrote an extraordinary book about that time immediately following World War II in the South, when soldiers came back, when African Americans came back, having served in the military, having done their job for their country, having believed that they were part of the larger conversation in this country and reality in this country, and returned to a South that was closed. And Edgerton actually writes about this moment in the South where there was some opening among white people, and then why it began to close down and why that began to happen. And this book is called Speak Now Against the Day. I wouldn't be surprised if it isn't here somewhere in the Smithsonian. It won the Robert Kennedy Prize the year that it came out. And it's very instructive about these kind of crucial moments, and when we begin to identify as who we are. We were Americans, and we came home and found out that we were still hillbillies and colored people and Native Americans. We had these names and identities that we were given, and in response to that, the two responses are either to try to acclimate, to pretend that you're not that person, to try to find your way into that larger American narrative, or it is to return back and go deeper into your identity as the marginal person and the marginal being. Food is prior to, there's also a movement in the 1960s in Appalachia where Appalachia becomes politicized again as well. If you've seen Harlan County, USA, the documentary, you know about that. But it's building on a moment that happened in the 1930s. We really have to sit down and do this. We got to do a timeline all around this room. No, but a movement that began actually at the turn of the century and goes into the 1930s of labor organization and political labor activity that is a piece of Appalachian history that we have had completely denied to us, and we are only now starting to talk about. I'm curious, how many people in this room know what I mean when I say Blair Mountain? Blair Mountain is the largest armed political resistance in the labor movement in the United States, and it happened in West Virginia, and it's only in the last 2 years that it is actually being taught in West Virginia. It's not taught at all in your schools. If you know anything about it, you know Matewan, John Sayles' beautiful movie, and I suggest that you see that movie as well. So there are these moments where identity becomes a tool for us to push back against the roles that we have been assigned. Food is not just a romantic part of that. I mean, it is, you know, it's like, you know, whenever 3 of us are gathered in the mountain's names, we're having a pepperoni roll or a chili bun or a pot of shucked beans, and we're, you know, recognizing each other. But food is also intrinsic. This early Appalachian experience in the coal mines, where the labor movement starts to come in, there's documentation. The labor organizers who were coming from, usually from the Northeast, into Illinois and Colorado, Utah, and into Appalachia in the coal fields in order to organize people. Appalachia became a focus and a stronghold because the people in the coal towns, the women and children in the coal towns, planted full gardens and raised a cow or for milk, or raised a pig to slaughter, and slaughtered their own food in order to break their reliance on the company store, so that when you went out on strike, you were not as endangered as the people in other areas that didn't have this history and didn't have this culture. Ironically enough, the first thing that began to happen when the Pinkerton Guards came in, when the thugs came in to throw the strikers out of their houses, they threw all of the belongings out of the house, and then they went into the gardens and destroyed the food and killed the animals. You know, so this is how food is. It is so much more than the beauty of saying, come sit at my table and let's talk about how this food got here and how we're here in this place. It has that power and it has that beauty, but when you start to research it and to look into it, you also discover that there are much more complicated and intricate stories about being an American than we have been told, and food, it becomes your pathway into that.
That is powerful and beautiful, and it reminds me of the moment at the African American Museum, which I go to as often as I can, about Reconstruction, this opening from 1866 to 1877, roughly, and the heartbreak of having this acceptance and political influence just erased through a Washington political compromise, and it happens again under Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Under Roosevelt, and it is. Some people might feel it's happening again today.
Oh, well, of course.
Yeah.
Of course,
I mean,
we're all thinking about
that
today as you
thing
speak.
about why are we here again? You know, I thought we resolved this, and it isn't resolved. We
And
have
so
to keep on.
we need a museum of Appalachian history that will tell us this kind
Of the real Appalachian history, which is much more complicated.
Or your book, Bill.
One of the things I want to just throw in here, just for us all to be reflecting on, I think, all day long, is that there's a famous book published by Hobsbawm and Ranger in the 1980s called The Invention of Tradition. And one of the claims that it makes is that we create these things that we call traditions because they anchor our identity, because at a particular political moment they enable us to assert a kind of authentic self or an authentic community. And those are very powerful. They're hugely important political tools. We can't, I think, do without them in the modern world, in the struggle against some of the negative consequences of modernity. But I kind of want to insist in this context that we are all historical. We all exist in time. We all change in time. And the whole history is who we are. There's not one moment that is authentic and another moment that's not authentic. It's all a struggle to figure out who we are and what it means to be human, what it means to be whoever you are trying to be at a given moment. And we thread together this web of stories, this web of past that make us an identity. So I was thinking about what you were saying, Sean. It's hard for me to imagine being Dene today without sheep. I mean,
Right,
it's central to
or horses for Lakota.
the horses Lakota. How do you do it? You can't do it.
Right.
It's a deep part of the history. And it would be to deny a really important part of the self, the culture. And so I'm sure that's a struggle in your work. How do you grapple with both those realities? Because you're a historical people. You exist in that
But
place.
it's also the history of urbanization and
All that.
actual
Right.
deracination,
All that, yeah.
which you were certainly talking about. It is time for Q&A. Have you peppered the Twitter collectors or the tweet collectors? We have at least one. And who presents the questions? Someone with a microphone. Do you
All
have
the way
any
back there.
for us?
I do. While the ushers can collect any of the cards, if anyone has any questions
More
that they've
cards.
written down.
More cards.
We have one question from Twitter so far, and please send in more at #SmithsonianFood. The question is that audience members have been so struck by the statements of, we've had our story given to us, we have had people to tell us who we are, and I couldn't just go online and order The Joy of Native American Cooking. As educators, formally and informally, how do you centralize narratives from the people who lived it as opposed to those stories that have been given to us?
So that requires the actual research of interviewing people and comparing their stories to the received stories. So Sean, do you want to start with that, and then Ronnie?
Sure. So basically looking at, because for the history of growing up on a tribal reservation is completely different than what we're reading about when we're going up to school, right? I feel like it's very consistent across the board because we spend a lot of time in many different tribes all across the U.S. We've been in the Southwest, we've been on the Pacific Northwest, we've been on the East Coast, we've been all over the place. And there's all these really wonderful, beautiful stories out there in Indian country in a sense of that. And these stories are not on history books at all. They don't talk about the immensity of agriculture throughout North America pre-Europeans, and how it was all the way up this East Coast up into parts of Canada, how it was all the way up the Mississippi and Missouri River Valley, and like how much corn culture was all over the place, and how it was so amazing that people growing corns, beans, squash, amaranth, chilies, things like that, thousands of years ago, way in the south of Mexico, were able to push that so far north. And we should have more of these conversations because there's so many beautiful strains that we still luckily have alive today. And I think it's really important to really look at people's stories, their own stories when it comes back to it. Because it's for indigenous peoples when it comes to especially our cuisine and our culture, which we lost heavily during the late 1800s and early 1900s. It's really important to rebuild that, but it's really important for the indigenous peoples to have that voice to be able to redefine it, to define it basically, to move forward, because the last thing indigenous peoples need are more Europeans telling them what their foods are, So, because it's that sense of Columbusing.
Yeah,
it's that
you're
sense
waving that corn cob.
yeah, it's a sense of discovering something that's been there for thousands
Right.
of years, and we see it all the time on TV. We see Eurocentric viewpoints going around the world discovering other people's foods and cultures, and these people are just like, well, we have this every day,
Right.
So,
Ronnie.
I was just imagining a television show where a European shows up and it's all from the perspective of the person they're there to discover instead. We'll never see it. One thing that was very valuable for me was that in my lifetime, in my adulthood, over the last 50 years, there has actually been a movement in scholarly circles to research and write the actual history of Appalachia as opposed to what has passed for history, which is what people come in and we call it a drive-by shooting. Somebody drops in with a camera and takes a picture, goes home and writes the story. That's been going on since our earliest history, voyeurs coming in and writing about those primitive people, et cetera. So there's been a tremendous amount of both scholarship, series-focused scholarship, and also narrative in fiction and nonfiction that illuminates what Appalachians have experienced and their stories from their own place. When I wrote the first proposal for Vittles, it was 2008, It took 6 years for me to find an editor who understood the story. His name is Francis Lamb. If you see him tomorrow, thank him for me. And a publisher that was willing to put up enough money for me to get in my van and drive around Appalachia, present-day Appalachia, and talk to other people and ask them to tell me their story of what they experienced. And before that happened, I had an offer from a publisher and an editor that I respect very much, but who had no money, University Press, but wanted me to, can't I write that book from my own experience? And aside from the fact that I'd actually written a book kind of like that 25 years earlier, my answer was no, I can't, because I can no more trust my singular experience to tell this whole story than I can trust someone else coming in and telling the story of my people at large. This has to be a combination of stories. Fortunately, after 6 years, I found the right place, Clarkson Potter and Francis Lamb, and hallelujah, a photographer and his wife, the food stylist, who saw through the eyes of a genuine Appalachian, and an art director whose first message to us was, thank God you understand the importance of shadow in telling the story of Appalachia. I'm from West Virginia. I think if all those things had not come together at any point, if we were expecting the art director who sends you the hillbilly equivalent of more cowbells, which is, where are the mason jars? Where's the gingham? Where's the apple butter in the crock? And instead we got someone who got the whole picture and went for it.
I think that every author in the room can attest to what an extremely rare story it is.
Oh my God, this author can attest to it.
And how very fortunate. So
Yes.
it will whet all of your appetites for victuals if you're not whetted already. Bill, did you want to say anything about the history of ethnography and how much it's gone from the outside versus the inside?
I think you just said what needed to be said. I mean, the field of ethnography, again, kind of emerges as a academic, scientific, Smithsonian-based discipline in the second half of the 19th century, and it's people going out, asking questions. One of the problems with that ethnography from the point of view of food is that for the most part, it's male interviewers talking with male informants. So the part of food and cooking that is gendered and gendered feminine gets elided just by the masculinity of the gathering process. And thinking
Amen.
it's a fundamental problem. It's a problem in the academy generally, that you could say that a whole series of female-dominated crafts and practices are not well served by the male academy because men just don't even notice what's going on in that field.
Great. Do we have another question?
Yes, they're really coming in from Twitter now. So I'm going to combine a few. A lot of people are commenting on the statement that was made earlier, food is always an expression of place. And questions have come in asking if food is always an expression of place, is cuisine always an expression of identity? Or how do we specify the cuisine of place when new immigrants and new arrivals bring new food traditions to regions?
Who wants to take the question?
I actually didn't track the questions.
Yeah,
Slow down a little bit. That was too fast.
Absolutely. So people are asking questions about the statement, food is always an expression of place, asking if food is always an expression of place, is cuisine an expression of identity, or is cuisine a way we can understand the relationship between food, place, and changing traditions with new immigrants bringing in
Too
new
broad a
traditions?
question.
So is the question distinguishing food from cooking techniques?
Right. In fact, let's not parse that question. Let's go to another one.
Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. So do you want to draw, I think part of the idea is, does cuisine kind of colonize foods of a region and draw it together in a way that it can be illegitimate and denaturing of the original culture of
I mean, boy, is that a complicated question. The one little soundbite I'd give on that I think is fascinating, if you know the history of the English language, And English, the language, is arguably the great colonial linguistic artifact of world history, because both the British Isles, in the series of invasions that defined Britain up through the Norman conquest, and then the series of colonizations that go outward from Britain and that import words into it, it has literally the largest vocabulary in the world, and it's a colonial vocabulary. The reason it's relevant to this question that's so fascinating is if you reflect on the words you use to describe foods, a great many of the core words we use for foods are Anglo-Saxon, which is to say monosyllabic Germanic words that are at least 1,500 years old in the language. A great many of the words we use for cooking techniques in the English language are French that came with the Normans and were languages of the upper classes speaking French over a peasantry that was speaking Germanic Anglo-Saxon. And so the food words are Germanic. The cooking words are Romance. They're French. And that's wired into the language as a ethnic class differential in the words we use in speaking without even noticing that we're reenacted a history of colonialism in the way we describe cooking.
And yet when you teach food writing, you notice this distinction constantly.
Constantly, right.
Sean, when you were a chef in fancy or not fancy Minneapolis restaurants, did you feel you were a cultural oppressor?
You know, I was very curious, and I think a lot of chefs are very curious. So I was always delving into different cultures around the world. You know, Ethiopian, Korean, Japanese, German, whatever my fancy took me, and I would really delve in and read a lot of history and really try to understand the foundations of it. And then I basically applied that to Native America when I started looking at my own self and my own history, realizing that I should have been learning about my own ancestors. And it was great to learn all of these other cultures, but when I started focusing on Native America, I basically threw a lot of those French textbooks away because I didn't need to. I could literally retrain myself from the ground up, literally, you know, because it didn't matter all of these French names of how to cut a carrot or, you know, and all of this, that just didn't matter anymore. So it was really trying to understand, but also knowing the immensity of the diversity of indigenous peoples across North America to start to look for those commonalities, to really start to piece it back together on a better sense. But understanding that food is this cultural identity that we hold on to. We think about our grandparents and our great-grandparents, and it really makes something, but food is also a great doorway to see into somebody else's culture.
Beautifully said. Ronnie.
So in terms of language, one of the tricks that I learned 25 years ago was that if I was going to explain to someone the best way to cook green beans, which are beans that actually have beans in them, not grass, it didn't work to say you put the pan on the back of the stove and you cook it for an hour and a half to 2 hours, because that was horrible. But if you said you braise them, you know, you braise them. And I discovered that there were all these lovely terms. You could explain grits by saying, oh, it's southern polenta. Somebody mentioned that to me today. So you get to turn that language back around and use it as a weapon. I kind of want to address this gigantic sort of question in
1 minute.
Yes. Yes. There's a book. I hope somebody's making a list of all the books.
I am.
Okay, there's a book called The Lazy Man's Guide to Enlightenment by a man named Thaddeus Golas, who, if you Google, is not the actor, he's someone else. And he tried to condense all the great religions and physics into a very small guidebook. And he ended up, I think, with maybe 12 points that are the steps to enlightenment. But the premise of it was, and then he said, if you can't remember 12 steps, just remember this. There are two places, fear and love, always go to love. Okay, that's my spiritual teaching for the day. But what he says is, physics tells us that the universe and everything in it is always expanding and contracting. As to this question about food and identity and place, I would refer you back to the Google map that we did in reverse and came back. Our identities are not a thing. Our identities are not something that is rigid. We insist on that as people. We want that kind of surety, or we want to draw a line and say, I'm on this side and I'm not on that side of it. But in fact, our identities are always in this process of expanding and contracting, so that it becomes a piece of the Appalachian identity that you string up the green beans and you dry them as your forebears did, and you eat shucked beans, but you also go to Wendy's and get the French fries and dip them into your Frosty smoothie, whatever it is. I don't know. I haven't gotten into this one yet. I'm working on expanding in that direction. Your
No
identity.
need. No need.
No need, right? I'm expanding, obviously, you know, but it's important when we have these conversations to keep opening to where does this go next, and when does it come back in, and how does it go back out and come back in. Think of it as a dance, not a stance.
So we're beautiful set.
Oh, that was great.
Way to go.
Brevity is the soul of wit. It is hard to imagine a more thoughtful, deep, or provocative conversation taking place today. Nonetheless, we all have rich imaginations. So thanks. Join me in thanking our wonderfully thoughtful panelists.
I also want to add one thing. That last question was really great, and there's a lot of layers to it. And luckily, we have at least 2 panels this afternoon that are going to delve into that very topic about what happens with the movements of people into regions and how do cuisines change. So please come back for that. And also, the cooking demonstrations tomorrow are all about that as well. So the conversation will continue. But now I know everybody wants to go get those books. So now's your chance. We're going to take a short break before our next panel. You can get coffee at the Jazz Cafe across the lobby. The book signings will be out this door in front of the food exhibition. And we will then reconvene at 11:20. We're running a little bit behind, but we're going to make it up. Thank you so much, and thank our panel for opening the day.